There is a story whispered through the shadows of history, a story that stretches back beyond the boundaries of religion and empire, beyond the records of civilization itself. It speaks of a book, not a holy scripture in the traditional sense, not a myth or philosophical treatise, but a manual, a system, a coded blueprint for transformation. This book was said to contain the steps not to salvation, but to self-deification. It claimed that the divine spark lies dormant in every human being, and that through specific practices, a person could awaken this spark, ascend beyond the limits of flesh and fear, and become something more, a god in form and function. It did not demand worship, it did not preach submission, and that made it dangerous. Not because it threatened the soul, but because it threatened the power of those who claimed to control what the soul was. Across time and cultures, fragments of this teaching have surfaced and disappeared. Its titles have changed, its authors erased, its language altered to obscure its true purpose. To some it was known as Liber Aeternum, to others the Codex of Becoming, or the Book of Divine Fire. It was never mass-produced, never openly published. It passed hand to hand, whispered in monasteries, sealed in the vaults of ancient orders, encoded in the frescoes of cathedrals and the geometry of temples. The moment someone tried to bring it into the open, it vanished again. Those who studied it publicly were discredited, exiled, or worse. Some disappeared without explanation. The reason was always the same. The book did not tell people how to serve gods. It told them how to become one. Its methods were said to be precise, rituals aligned with breath and sound, inner alchemy, the manipulation of energy within the body, and the visualization of sacred forms. It was not faith-based. It was experiential. It did not ask for belief. It demanded practice. And those who practiced it according to the lore began to change. Their awareness expanded. Their perceptions shifted. They reported visions, strength, intuition, and a dissolving of the veil between the material and the infinite. This was not metaphor. This was transformation. And that made it the greatest threat to every structure built on obedience, fear, and control. You will not find this book on any shelf, but its fingerprints are everywhere, in the myths of heroes who rise from mortality, in the mystery schools that speak of inner fire, in the suppressed gospels and forbidden grimoires hidden beneath Vatican stone and desert sands. It is not one book, not anymore. It is a broken mirror, scattered across time, each shard holding part of the truth. And when pieced together, they do not show a God looking down, but a God waking up. The question is not whether the book existed. The question is, what would happen if the knowledge inside it were remembered? Not just studied, but lived. Not worshipped, but embodied. And who would you become if you were no longer told what you are, but shown what you could be? According to the few fragments that survived censorship and time, the book that turned men into gods did not originate in any known civilization, religion, or culture. Its roots stretch back to a time before formal history, before ink touched scroll, before stone tablets bore laws, before temples were raised in devotion to any god. The whispers surrounding this elusive manuscript trace its birth to a primordial source, a proto-civilization that predated Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. This lost origin is echoed in myths of vanished golden ages, Atlantis, Lemuria, Shambhala, places described not just as advanced technologically, but spiritually, where the human being was understood as a conduit of divine force, not a sinner, servant, or subject. Many traditions describe a time when humanity was closer to the gods, or, in some cases, was divine itself. The book, it is said, was born in this context, not as scripture, but as memory. Not written initially, but encoded into oral traditions, sacred geometry, ritual acts, and subtle language systems meant to bypass the rational mind and activate dormant parts of consciousness. In these early eras, knowledge was not merely transmitted, it was embodied. The book was a living current, not a bound object. It only became text later, as civilizations fell and knowledge was fractured. But even as fragments, its pulse endured. Archaeological anomalies suggest echoes of a forgotten sophistication. Megalithic structures whose alignments mirror celestial paths with impossible precision. Symbols repeated across continents with no clear connection, and accounts of god-kings and sages with abilities far beyond the norm. These patterns, dismissed by mainstream academia, point to a shared metaphysical understanding, possibly preserved in a single lineage of teachings. Many believe that what we call the book was the distilled essence of this ancient wisdom, a practical guide to unlocking the human's hidden capacities. It was not bound to a single people, language, or mythology, but appeared in multiple cultures under different names, symbols, and veils. In Sumerian texts, we find references to the Me, a collection of divine laws or formulas governing all aspects of civilization and transformation, said to be guarded by the gods. In the Egyptian tradition, the legend of Thoth speaks of a hidden book said to grant mastery over heaven and earth, containing secrets so powerful that even the gods feared its misuse. This book, the Book of Thoth, was always hidden, always protected, always meant only for the worthy. In the Hindu Vedas, the concept of Brahma-vidya refers to the knowledge of ultimate reality, the science of God realization. This knowledge was oral, passed through lineage, shrouded in metaphor and mantra to protect it from distortion. Similar motifs appear in the Tibetan Dzogchen and Bon traditions, where advanced teachings were concealed as termas, hidden treasures, buried not only in caves and statues but in consciousness itself, waiting to be discovered by those whose minds were ready. In Mesoamerican myths, Quetzalcoatl brings sacred knowledge to humanity before vanishing into the stars, promising to return when the world is ready. In the Old Testament, the figure of Enoch is said to have walked with God, been taken up into heaven, and shown the workings of the cosmos. A journey elaborated in the banned Book of Enoch, which describes watchers, sacred geometry, and transformation through heavenly knowledge. These recurring themes suggest not a linear origin, but a shared inheritance. What if the book that turned men into gods was not a single volume written in one place and time, but an archetypal current manifesting across cultures? An eternal pattern that reemerges whenever human consciousness reaches toward its own forgotten potential? The idea that certain beings, sages, prophets, or initiates, periodically recover fragments of this knowledge points to an ancient metaphysical ecology where wisdom is not invented but retrieved. These beings may have encoded what they learned into cryptic texts, temples, artworks, and oral teachings, all designed to conceal and reveal depending on the level of the seeker. As empires rose and fell, those in power began to understand the disruptive potential of this knowledge. The book did not teach worship or submission, it taught sovereignty. It did not describe gods to fear, it showed how to become one. This idea threatened the foundations of theocratic states and religious hierarchies built on intermediaries between the divine and the human. And so the book, in whatever form it existed, became the target of erasure. If the earliest version was ever written on papyrus or parchment, it is likely long destroyed. What remains is the myth, the pattern, the echo. But in this echo are pieces of a system so persistent that it continues to resurface despite every effort to bury it. The myth of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity, is often interpreted as a metaphor for knowledge, specifically forbidden knowledge. In many ways, the book is that fire, and like Prometheus, those who shared its light were punished, bound, or silenced. In Gnostic texts, such as the Apocryphon of John, the world is revealed to be a prison crafted by a false god, the Demiurge, who fears that humanity might awaken to its divine nature. The serpent in Eden, often cast as Satan, is in this version a liberator, bringing knowledge and freedom. The book echoes this function. It awakens the divine spark, challenges the illusion, and threatens the order. Throughout history, spiritual initiates have spoken of receiving teachings in dreams, visions, or altered states of consciousness, downloads of information not learned, but remembered. Could it be that the book is not only external, but internal? That it is embedded in the deeper layers of our own being, and the external manuscripts, rituals, and symbols are only mirrors pointing inward? If so, the origin of the book is not historical. It is archetypal. It emerges wherever human beings long not to serve the gods, but to become them. Not out of pride, but out of the recognition that what we call the divine is not separate, but latent. This idea is not new. It is perennial, and its survival, despite millennia of suppression, suggests that it is not merely a story. It is a blueprint waiting to be read again. Not with the eyes, but with the soul. Not for worship, but for transformation. In every age, a few find fragments of the book, in language or silence, in symbol or experience. And each time, the question remains, will the seeker use it for illusion or illumination? Will the God within be awakened, or feared again into forgetting? The very reason the book that turned men into gods has remained shrouded in mystery and buried beneath layers of myth, suppression, and disinformation is not simply because it was esoteric or difficult to understand, or even blasphemous by traditional standards. It is because the knowledge it contained posed an existential threat to the foundational power structures that governed the ancient world and continue to echo through religious and political institutions today. The book was not merely banned, it was feared, not because it promoted chaos or violence, but because it offered liberation at the deepest level. The unmediated realization of the divine within. It threatened to eliminate the need for priests, dogma, hierarchies, and even the concept of salvation as something granted from above. It taught that humanity was not fallen, but asleep, and that awakening was possible through individual practice, not collective obedience. In the earliest centuries of institutional religion, particularly in the formation of Christianity, knowledge of this kind was not only rejected, but actively persecuted. As Rome merged with early Christianity, what had once been a mystical path of inner transformation rapidly evolved into a state-controlled system of moral governance. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE marked one of the most pivotal moments in this transformation. It was here that a centralized canon of scripture was formalized, and divergent views, especially Gnostic texts that emphasized personal gnosis over ecclesiastical authority, were declared heretical. These Gnostic texts, many of which may have contained fragments or echoes of the original book, spoke not of original sin, but of original light. They did not emphasize repentance through clergy, but remembrance through self-knowledge. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, opens with the phrase, "Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death." It speaks in riddles and paradoxes, inviting contemplation, not obedience. Its Jesus figure does not perform miracles for public adoration, but acts as a teacher guiding others to find the kingdom within. This kind of message threatened not only the authority of bishops and theologians, but the entire structure that had been built around sin, guilt, and redemption. If salvation could be found within, then what purpose did the Church serve? As Christianity expanded, so too did its control over texts and teachings. Libraries were destroyed, scrolls burned, and oral traditions stamped out. The famed Library of Alexandria, though destroyed in stages, represented the loss of countless volumes that may have preserved traces of the book's lineage. Later, the Inquisition systematized this suppression with unprecedented precision. Accusations of heresy were often vague and confessions extracted under torture. Those found guilty of reading, possessing, or even speaking about certain dangerous teachings were publicly executed. Many of these banned teachings revolved around inner transformation, sacred sexuality, the power of symbols, and the non-duality of spirit and matter, hallmarks of the kind of knowledge described in the Lost Book. The rise of empires was equally threatened by the book's teachings. Imperial systems thrive on order, hierarchy, and a clear delineation between ruler and subject. The book's central premise, that divinity is not distant and external but immanent and internal, erodes this structure from its foundation. If every person is a potential god, not metaphorically but experientially, then no king, emperor, or pope holds absolute authority. The power to create, to heal, to understand cosmic law is no longer monopolized by a ruling elite, but returned to the individual. Such a vision of self-mastery undermines the legitimacy of those who rule by divine right. Even in the more esoteric and mystical branches of mainstream religion, this tension is apparent. Within Christianity, the few mystics who express direct experiences of the divine without church mediation, figures like Meister Eckhart, Marguerite Porete, and Giordano Bruno, were persecuted, excommunicated, or executed. Porete's book The Mirror of Simple Souls, which spoke of the soul's union with God beyond all forms and structures, was burned, and she with it. Bruno, who taught of an infinite universe filled with divine potential and the divinity within man, was famously burned at the stake. What they all shared was not rebellion for its own sake, but a deep inner experience of unity with the divine, the very kind of awakening the book was said to catalyze. The threat extended beyond the church and into early science and philosophy. Hermetic and alchemical traditions, often dismissed as superstition, held encoded versions of the book's core principles. Alchemy, when read esoterically, is not the transformation of metals, but of the self. The base lead of the ego becomes the gold of awakened consciousness through a precise series of inner processes. The emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, with its famous line, "As above, so below," encapsulates a worldview in which man is a microcosm of the universe, capable of aligning with cosmic forces through will and understanding. This was not magical thinking. It was metaphysical practice. And it required no priest, no church, no emperor. Only knowledge and the courage to apply it. To maintain dominance, both church and state needed to obscure this knowledge. Not by outright denial, that would only attract curiosity, but through conflation, distortion, and ridicule. The book and its teachings were rebranded as sorcery, blasphemy, or madness. Inner light became dangerous pride. The divine feminine, often central in transformational practices, became a symbol of temptation and sin. Symbols were stripped of their multidimensional meanings and redefined in narrow moralistic terms. Over time, even the language to describe the kind of consciousness the book cultivated was lost. What was once awakening became heresy. What was once sacred became demonic. Yet the suppression of the book was never entirely successful. Like a submerged continent, its presence continues to influence spiritual traditions, visionary art, and alternative philosophies. Its re-emergence in fragments, through Eastern teachings, mystical poetry, sacred geometry, breathwork traditions, and the resurgence of esoteric schools, shows that the core idea remains irrepressible. But it also shows why it was banned. The book does not tell you what to believe. It does not promise salvation if you follow a creed. It invites you to enter the fire of transformation, to die to your conditioned self, and to rise as something new, something sovereign, luminous, and uncontrollable. To those who depend on control, there is no greater threat than a soul that remembers its own light. And so, for centuries, the book has remained in exile, hidden in plain sight, encrypted in myths, burned yet unburnable, waiting not to be worshipped, but to be read again in the only place it was ever truly written, the awakened human heart. What the book that turned men into gods actually taught remains a mystery veiled in fragments, allusions, and symbolic language preserved through esoteric traditions, mystical poetry, sacred architecture, and oral transmissions. Yet, those fragments, when examined with attention, patience, and comparative insight, begin to reveal the outline of a coherent system of inner transformation. It was not a philosophical or theological treatise meant to explain the world through abstractions. Nor was it a religious scripture seeking to enforce morality or submission. It was a manual, a map, and, in some interpretations, a set of vibrational instructions for triggering a metamorphosis in human consciousness. What it described was a process that could transmute the human condition from unconscious limitation into awakened divinity. Not in a metaphorical sense, but in practical, repeatable terms, through disciplined application of specific techniques designed to restructure the inner architecture of the self. At its core, the book taught that the divine was not something external to be worshipped, but an innate potential encoded into the very structure of the human being. It posited that what religion called God, mysticism called spirit, and alchemy called quintessence, was already present, dormant, and awaiting activation. The book did not claim this transformation could occur through belief, but through practice. It outlined a process consisting of several stages, each corresponding to the refinement of body, mind, energy, and perception. These stages mirrored the principles found across global esoteric systems: purification, alignment, activation, expansion, and integration. The initial teachings focused on the body, not as something to be transcended, but as a vessel to be awakened. Breath was central, not ordinary respiration, but intentional, rhythmic, vibrational breathwork designed to harmonize the nervous system, cleanse emotional residues, and open internal channels of energy. This is reflected in practices like pranayama in the yogic tradition, tumo in Tibetan Buddhism, and the Egyptian practice of sekhem breathing. The book described breath as the bridge between the material and the immaterial, a tool for refining the subtle body and expanding the capacity to receive and contain divine frequency. Diet, posture, fasting, and sexual conduct were also addressed, not as moral prescriptions, but as energetic disciplines. Food was understood not merely as sustenance, but as vibration. Certain substances dampened the energetic body, while others sharpened it. Sexual energy, far from being condemned, was regarded as a core component of transformation. When directed and sublimated through intentional focus, it became a fuel for awakening higher centers of consciousness, what some traditions called kundalini, others serpent fire, or the inner star. The book contained diagrams, geometric and symbolic, mapping the internal energy system. Centers, akin to chakras, channels, and fields of resonance. These diagrams served as practical guides, not symbolic flourishes. Mental training was the next layer. The book offered techniques for concentration, visualization, and inner stillness. The goal was not to adopt dogma, but to decondition perception. The mind, filled with inherited thought patterns, reactive tendencies, and external programming, was seen as the first prison. Through visualization of sacred forms, repeated engagement with archetypal symbols, and contemplation of paradox, the practitioner would begin to unhook consciousness from conditioned perception and awaken direct knowing. Gnosis. The book emphasized that reality was not simply observed, but co-created through attention and vibration. Therefore, changing perception was not just an internal affair, but a reconfiguration of the very fabric of experience. The heart center, both physically and energetically, played a critical role. The book described a subtle fire that lived within the chest, a radiance that could be cultivated into a field of perception so refined it could detect and interact with layers of existence invisible to the ordinary senses. Through deep emotional purification, practices of forgiveness, reverence, and gratitude not imposed by external morality, but generated from awakened feeling, the practitioner would begin to stabilize the inner fire. This fire was not emotional turbulence, but a form of intelligent warmth capable of sustaining the body through radical transformation. It was also through this center that the practitioner began to dissolve the illusion of separation, experiencing directly the interconnectedness of all life. Sound, particularly sacred sound, was another foundational element. The book contained a series of tones, syllables, and harmonic chants that corresponded to different energy centers, planetary frequencies, and dimensions of awareness. These were not random mantras, but codes. When vocalized with precision and intention, they acted like keys, unlocking dormant pathways in the psyche and etheric body. Combined with visualization and breath, these sounds could bring about altered states of consciousness that were not hallucinations, but structured expansions into higher fields of awareness. The book warned, however, that without proper preparation, such openings could destabilize the psyche. Therefore, the path was progressive, exacting, and rooted in ethical alignment, not morality dictated from outside, but a natural harmony born from inner clarity. The culmination of the book's teachings was the construction or awakening of what many esoteric systems call the light body, the glorified, radiant vehicle of consciousness that exists in potential within every human being. This body was not visible to the untrained eye, but perceivable in deep states of meditation, lucid dreaming, or near-death experience. It was described as the immortal sheath, the true identity beyond flesh and time, and the vessel through which one could traverse dimensions, access cosmic knowledge, and, upon physical death, retain full awareness instead of dissolving into unconscious rebirth. The light body was not gifted. It was built, layer by layer, through disciplined practice, deep insight, and continuous purification. Symbols such as the serpent, the rose, the phoenix, the spiral, and the eye appeared frequently in the book's diagrams and language. These were not artistic embellishments, but coded references to inner processes. The serpent, often feared or misrepresented, symbolized rising energy and wisdom. The rose indicated the flowering of heart consciousness. The phoenix represented death and rebirth within the same lifetime. The spiral marked the path of evolution, not linear but recursive, each cycle moving higher. And the eye, whether singular or trinitarian, referred to awakened perception beyond duality. Importantly, the book did not present its path as superior or exclusive. It did not claim to be the only way to God, but a method for unveiling the God within. It warned against pride, fanaticism, and spiritual bypassing. The more awakened one became, the more humility and responsibility were required. True power, it emphasized, was never control over others, but mastery of the self and service to the whole. The final chapters, or what remains of them, hinted at communion with what it called the Great Field, the unified intelligence permeating all existence. This communion was not ecstatic detachment, but a grounded state of luminous being, fully human, fully divine. In sum, the book taught that the journey to godhood was not a fantasy or metaphor. but an evolutionary imperative embedded in the very design of human existence. Its teachings were not esoteric for the sake of secrecy, but to protect the unprepared and preserve the transmission from corruption. Its knowledge was structured, sacred, and precise, and for those willing to walk its path, it promised nothing less than the reawakening of what we have always been, but have forgotten in the noise of external power, institutional doctrine, and inherited fear. It was a call to remember, to refine, and to rise. Not to believe in gods, but to become one. Not in pride, but in purpose. While the book that turned men into gods was banned, burned, and aggressively suppressed by religious and imperial authorities, it did not vanish. Instead, it was driven underground, preserved, protected, and encrypted within the frameworks of secret societies, occult orders, and initiatory lineages that maintained its fragments under layers of allegory, symbolism, and ritual. The survival of the book's teachings is not due to chance, but to a deliberate and multi-generational effort by individuals and groups who understood that this knowledge, though forbidden, was sacred and essential to the evolution of human consciousness. These societies did not preserve the book as a single manuscript, but as a living current, a coded transmission dispersed across art, architecture, mystery plays, initiation rites, and oral teachings. What we now call esotericism or the occult is, in many respects, the camouflage the book wore in order to survive. The earliest known custodians of the book's essence may have been the mystery schools of ancient Egypt. The Temple of Luxor, for example, was not just a center of worship, but a place of spiritual training, constructed according to principles of sacred geometry and human anatomy. Its layout mirrored the human body, guiding initiates from the base to the crown, mimicking the internal journey from ignorance to illumination. Within such temples, teachings were passed orally and symbolically. Hieroglyphs acted as visual mantras, transmitting layers of meaning to the trained initiate. The god Thoth, said to be the author of the Lost Book of Wisdom, was not a deity in the literal sense, but a personification of higher intellect and cosmic order. Texts attributed to Thoth, later compiled into what we now know as the Hermetica, contained veiled references to the same process of inner alchemy that the book described: the purification of the self, mastery of the elements, awakening of the light, body, and union with the divine mind. When Egypt fell under foreign rule and the mystery schools dissolved, many initiates fled to Greece, where their teachings influenced the Orphic and Eleusinian mysteries. These cults centered on death and rebirth, not as mythology, but as initiatory reality. The initiate symbolically died to the false self and was reborn into gnosis, direct knowledge of the immortal essence. Socrates, Plato, and Pythagoras all drank from this well, and their writings contain echoes of the book's doctrine: the soul's journey, the importance of inner discipline, the harmony of the cosmos mirrored within. Pythagoras, in particular, established an initiatory school in Croton that mirrored the structure of Egyptian mystery schools. His teachings on number, proportion, and vibration were not academic curiosities, but doorways into perceiving reality as a divine matrix, a concept central to the book's metaphysical worldview. As the Roman Empire expanded and Christianity became institutionalized, these currents went further underground. The Gnostics, often wrongly portrayed as heretical sectarians, were among the last groups to carry open fragments of the book's knowledge. Their texts, such as the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip, emphasize self-realization over belief, the divine spark within over external saviors. After their eradication, the surviving threads of the tradition were woven into new forms: alchemy, Kabbalah, astrology, and ceremonial magic. These disciplines, often seen as disparate or disconnected, were in fact facets of a deeper system, encoded remnants of the book, fragmented but still functional. During the Middle Ages and Renaissance, secret societies began to formalize their custodianship of this knowledge. The Rosicrucians emerged in Europe in the early 1600s, publishing manifestos that blended Christian mysticism with Hermetic and alchemical thought. Their texts, such as the Fama Fraternitatis and the Confessio, spoke of a hidden order guarding ancient wisdom and working silently for the spiritual regeneration of humanity. They referenced a Book M, or Book T, in their allegories, texts of supreme knowledge that could only be accessed by those purified in heart and mind. These were not literal books so much as symbols for the inner teachings of the initiatory path, passed down in veiled language that only the initiated could decode. The Freemasons, too, played a role in preserving aspects of the book. While modern Freemasonry is often viewed as a fraternal organization with civic overtones, its origins are steeped in symbolism that maps onto the path of inner transformation. The tools of the Mason, the compass, the square, the trowel, are metaphors for refining the soul. The lodge, with its levels and degrees, mirrors the inner temple. The idea of building the Temple of Solomon is a cipher for constructing the perfected self. Though much of Freemasonry became secularized over time, certain higher degrees, especially in rites like the Scottish or York, retain ritual language and structure that reflects knowledge aligned with the book's system. In parallel, the Kabbalistic tradition, particularly within the Jewish mystical schools of Spain and Saft, developed a cosmology and meditative system aimed at uniting the lower and higher self. The Tree of Life, with its 10 Sephiroth and 22 paths, is a psycho-spiritual map that aligns with the book's multi-layered process. In its practical form, through techniques like ecstatic prayer, permutation of divine names, and visualization, the Kabbalah offered initiates tools to ascend the internal ladder of being. These teachings were also absorbed into Christian mysticism and later Western occultism, forming the backbone of systems like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and the Thelemic tradition founded by Aleister Crowley. Crowley himself believed he had accessed the same current. In 1904, he wrote the Book of the Law, a channeled text that emphasized the divinization of the individual will, the sanctity of personal experience, and the rejection of imposed morality. All themes aligned with the original book's message. Though Crowley's style and ethics remain controversial, the core of his system, the disciplined use of ritual, symbol, and inner technology, mirrors the essence of what the book conveyed: self-transcendence through intentional transformation. In more recent times, modern esoteric orders such as the Builders of the Adytum, the Temple of the Golden Flame, and certain schools of Sufism, Taoist alchemy, and Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism have continued to work with knowledge that parallels the book's path. What unites them is a shared understanding that the divine is not a matter of belief, but of becoming, that true knowledge cannot be given. It must be earned, embodied, and lived. Across continents and centuries, the book's preservation has depended not on libraries or digital databases, but on the living chain of initiates. Masters transmitted to disciples not only techniques but states of consciousness, symbolic codes, and energetic activations. The book was never meant for the masses in its raw form. Its potency demanded discernment. If given to the unprepared, it could disintegrate rather than integrate the psyche. Therefore, secrecy was not elitism, it was protection, both of the teaching and the seeker. Yet in this modern age, the boundaries between exoteric and esoteric have begun to dissolve. The teachings once cloaked in ritual and symbol are surfacing in language of psychology, neuroscience, and energy medicine. The book, scattered and encoded, is reassembling through the convergence of ancient wisdom and modern understanding. And still, the secret societies remain. Not as conspiracies, but as stewards, waiting for those who are ready to read the old codes with new eyes and carry the flame forward, not for power, but for light. In the modern age, the echoes of the book that turned men into gods are no longer confined to cloistered temples, secret lodges, or hidden manuscripts. As the veil of dogma thins and access to information becomes nearly limitless, fragments of the book have emerged into the open, not always in the form of formal doctrine, but as a widespread renaissance of practices, concepts, and inner technologies that mirror its original teachings. These fragments, now interwoven into countless disciplines and movements, have been stripped of their original context, but their presence is undeniable. From the rise of mindfulness and breathwork to the rediscovery of sacred geometry, energy healing, and plant medicine, the modern spiritual landscape has become a mosaic of forgotten truths rediscovered and repurposed for a new era. And yet, most who engage with these tools have no idea they are working with remnants of a once-forbidden system designed not simply for healing or calm, but for full-scale transformation of the human being into something radiant, sovereign, and divine. One of the most striking examples of the book's re-emergence can be found in the resurgence of breath-centered modalities. Practices like holotropic breathwork, Wim Hof breathing, and pranayama have entered the mainstream, often framed through scientific or therapeutic lenses. These techniques, while modernized, trace directly back to ancient systems that understood the breath not only as a physiological function, but as a carrier of consciousness. In the book's terms, breath was the conductor of internal fire, the means through which the practitioner harmonized body and mind, and prepared the subtle vehicle for higher activation. The deliberate use of rhythm, retention, and focus in breathing, was not for stress relief alone. It was for awakening dormant faculties of perception and reconfiguring the nervous system to accommodate an influx of higher frequency awareness. Simultaneously, the language of energy centers, popularized as chakras, has permeated wellness culture across the globe. Though often presented simplistically, these centers correspond to key nodes in the energetic body, as described in the book's schematics. What was once guarded knowledge, illustrated in esoteric symbols, and carefully passed through initiatory transmission, is now available on posters, apps, and YouTube tutorials. Each center is associated with specific qualities: will, emotion, vision, speech. But their purpose, according to the deeper teaching, is not to balance individual traits, but to create an aligned channel through which divine consciousness can descend and express itself fully through human form. When aligned, the centers become not only a map, but a ladder, each rung representing a stage of refinement and embodiment. Though the original coherence of this system has been diluted, its structure survives, awaiting those who will look beyond the surface. Another resurgence comes in the form of sacred geometry and the increasing fascination with fractals, cymatics, and the mathematics of consciousness. The book taught that the universe is built upon patterns, vibrational archetypes that repeat across scales, from the structure of a leaf to the movement of galaxies. These patterns were not merely aesthetic, they were functional. To meditate on them, replicate them, or even build physical spaces according to their ratios was to attune to the deeper harmony of creation. In modern times, this wisdom re-emerges through the exploration of the flower of life, the golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequence, and complex mandalas used in meditation and architecture. Whether in the blueprints of ancient temples or the double helix of DNA, these forms point to an underlying intelligence, what the book described as the divine code woven into the very matrix of reality. Understanding and embodying this code was a key to becoming more than human, not in a genetic sense, but in consciousness. Plant medicine traditions, long marginalized and criminalized, have also re-entered the collective awareness as conduits for inner revelation. Substances like ayahuasca, psilocybin, iboga, and DMT are now studied for their therapeutic potential. But beyond clinical outcomes, these sacraments often induce archetypal journeys that mirror initiatory death and rebirth. Central themes of the book's transformative path: users report contact with intelligences, downloads of ancient knowledge, and encounters with their own divine nature. While these experiences can be chaotic or disorienting without proper preparation and integration, they speak to the same reality the book prepared its initiates for: that there are levels of consciousness beyond the physical, and that the human mind, when properly tuned, is a gateway, not a container. The substances themselves are not the book, but they open the door to the same rooms the book once illuminated with sacred instruction. The field of psychology has also absorbed fragments of the book, particularly through the integration of Jungian archetypes, shadow work, and transpersonal frameworks. Carl Jung's concepts of the self, the individuation process, and the collective unconscious echo the book's emphasis on internal alchemy, the integration of polarities, the confrontation with repressed aspects of the psyche, and the eventual realization of the higher self. Practices such as active imagination and dream work, once the domain of mystics and shamans, are now legitimate paths of inquiry for those seeking psychological wholeness. Yet Jung himself admitted that his models only scratched the surface of deeper initiatory processes that ancient cultures had already mastered. In this sense, modern psychology has become a gateway, a way for seekers to begin understanding the inner terrain mapped long ago by the book's diagrams and disciplines. The digital age has further accelerated the dispersion of these teachings. Platforms like YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram are saturated with spiritual content, some authentic, some superficial. Meditation, visualization, quantum manifestation, the law of attraction, reality shifting, all of these phenomena, though often stripped of depth, point back to the book's core message. Consciousness shapes reality, and the inner world determines the outer. Even the concept of creating one's own reality, once relegated to occult teachings, has become a pop spiritual mantra. While much of this is diluted and commercialized, the underlying principle remains potent. The risk is that without the grounding and ethical scaffolding the book originally provided, such knowledge becomes misused, distorted by ego, consumed as novelty, or weaponized as a means of control rather than liberation. Yet amidst the noise, something real is happening. A new generation of seekers, disillusioned by institutional religion and mechanistic science, is turning inward. They are piecing together the fragments, cross-referencing traditions, testing practices, and, in many cases, experiencing the awakening the book promised. They may not call it that. They may not know they are continuing a lineage. But they are remembering. And in that remembrance, the book lives again. Not as dogma, not as artifact, but as activation. We see this revival in the convergence of disciplines once held apart. Spirituality and science, mysticism and neuroscience, ritual and psychotherapy. Heart coherence is measured with machines. Altered states are tracked with brain scans. Sacred sounds are analyzed for frequency impact. We are learning slowly that the book was never myth. It was early science. Spiritual technology articulated through the language of symbol, because language was not yet ready for its truth. Now, as we rediscover those symbols and match them with modern tools, the old knowledge becomes new again. Not lost, only waiting. In this new age, the book no longer needs to hide, but it still requires discernment. The abundance of information can become a distraction, a hall of mirrors reflecting everything but illuminating nothing. The true fragments must be recognized not just by the intellect, but by the resonance they produce in the body, the clarity they bring to the heart, and the alignment they generate in action. The book will not shout. It never has. But it is speaking, softly, through many voices, waiting for those who remember not what they've learned, but what they've always known, deep beneath the surface. That the divine is not something to be sought, but something to be uncovered. And that the journey home is not upward, but inward. One breath, one step, one remembrance at a time. If the teachings of the book that turned men into gods were once a hidden current, moving silently beneath the surface of history, then the implications of their re-emergence in modern consciousness cannot be overstated. At its core, the book did not merely offer knowledge or philosophy. It proposed a complete reorientation of what it means to be human. Its instructions, once followed, had the potential to collapse centuries of theological conditioning, to undermine political systems built on dependency, and to awaken individuals to a state of sovereignty so complete that the structures of control, be they religious, ideological, economic, or psychological, would be rendered obsolete. This was the real danger of the book. Not blasphemy, not heresy, but freedom. And not freedom in the abstract, but in the deepest, most embodied sense. A freedom born of direct contact with the divine force within. Personal divinity, as taught by the book, does not imply egoic inflation or the shallow claim that one is a god in the colloquial sense. It means something far more nuanced, far more dangerous to the world as it is currently constructed. To realize oneself as divine is to perceive reality not as something imposed from the outside, but as something co-created, shaped by consciousness, and responsive to intent. It is to see through the illusion of separation, not only from others, but from the source of life itself. The divine is no longer a being out there, but the ground of one's own awareness. And this changes everything. No longer can morality be dictated from pulpits. No longer can identity be confined by nation, creed, or class. No longer can fear be used as the primary mechanism of social order. Such an awakening would be disruptive on every level. Religiously, it dissolves the need for intermediaries between the human and the divine. It renders obsolete entire hierarchies built on the assumption of spiritual scarcity, that only certain people, in certain robes, with certain titles, can access truth. Politically, it undermines systems of control that rely on a disempowered population conditioned to look outward for authority. Economically, it challenges the commodification of spirituality, education, and even healing, replacing external solutions with inner mastery. Psychologically, it confronts the very foundations of identity, requiring the seeker to move beyond victimhood, tribalism, and conditioned narratives into a space of radical self-responsibility. This is why the book was banned. Not for what it said, but for what it did. It activated people. It initiated an inner revolution. And revolutions of that kind do not just change governments, they change worlds. If even a small fraction of the population were to integrate the book's teachings, not just intellectually but somatically, emotionally, and spiritually, the collective paradigm would shift. Not gradually, but tectonically. Old myths would crumble. New values would emerge, rooted not in fear or obedience, but in presence, compassion, and creative agency. People would cease to be consumers of life and become participants in its unfolding. Such a world would not be utopia. It would still contain challenge, shadow, and complexity. But it would be real, authentic, alive in a way that modern civilization, with all its simulations of meaning, cannot replicate. The implications stretch beyond human systems. The book also taught that when one awakens their internal light, they become attuned to the larger field of consciousness, the intelligence that permeates all matter, all form, all life. This reconnection has ecological consequences. It dissolves the subject-object divide and births a sense of sacred responsibility toward the earth, not as resource, but as living being. The practitioner no longer views nature as separate, but as an extension of their own energetic body. From this perspective, environmental destruction is not only unsustainable, it is sacrilege. The awakened individual cannot participate in such desecration without violating their own nature. Thus, the book's revival carries within it not just spiritual consequences, but ecological ones, a potential pivot away from exploitation and toward symbiosis. And yet, this process is not without peril. The book warned, often through symbol and paradox, that awakening was not a guarantee of peace or bliss. The expansion of consciousness brings with it the confrontation of shadow. To access personal divinity is to dismantle the false self, the layers of ego, trauma, and social conditioning that have formed the illusion of who we are. This dismantling can be disorienting, even devastating, if not navigated with care. It is the death before rebirth, the descent before ascent. Those who walk this path must pass through fire, not imposed by any deity, but forged within as the alchemical crucible of transformation. Without proper grounding, such experiences can fracture the psyche rather than liberate it. This is why the book emphasized preparation, integrity, and a foundation of inner stillness before the more advanced practices could even be attempted. In the modern world, this warning is more relevant than ever. As fragments of the book become accessible to millions through media, apps, workshops, and influencers, the risk is that powerful technologies of transformation will be engaged without the context or maturity needed to wield them. The result is not awakening, but spiritual inflation, a mimicry of divinity that lacks depth, discipline, or discernment. The original custodians of the book understood this, which is why its teachings were guarded, veiled in metaphor, and entrusted only to those who demonstrated readiness. In a time of instant gratification and mass distraction, the challenge is not access, but integration. The book's power has never been in its words alone, but in the living transmission that occurs when practice becomes embodiment, and knowledge becomes wisdom. Yet despite the risks, the process is underway. The call to awaken, the same call whispered by sages, mystics, and initiates for millennia, is being heard again. Not universally, but in pulses, waves, and nodes of emergence around the planet. Artists, healers, scientists, and ordinary people are remembering that they are more than their names, roles, or histories. They are remembering that within them lives a spark that, when nurtured, can illuminate entire lifetimes. This is not mythology. It is human potential. The book did not claim to create gods. It reminded humans that they were never separate from divinity to begin with, that the fall was forgetfulness, and the return was remembrance. The implications of such remembrance are vast. They demand the redesign of education to honor intuition as well as logic, the transformation of medicine to treat energy as well as matter, the rebirth of governance rooted not in coercion, but in the wisdom of awakened citizens. These are not pipe dreams. They are glimpses of what becomes possible when enough individuals stop waiting for external saviors and begin cultivating the inner flame. The book pointed toward that fire. And now, in a time of global crisis and existential uncertainty, it returns. Not as prophecy, but as potential. The greatest revolution is not fought with weapons, but with awareness. The most radical act is to remember who and what we truly are. The book that turned men into gods was never about control or dominion. It was about wholeness. It was about becoming so aligned, so attuned, so luminously present that the illusion of separation dissolves and the human stands revealed, not as a sinner, not as a subject, but as a sovereign vessel of the divine. This is the implication. This is the invitation. And for those who are ready, the book has never been closer. It is no longer hidden. It is encoded in the very architecture of your being, waiting not to be believed, but to be lived. And now, As we stand on the threshold of a world in flux, where truth is contested, meaning is fragmented, and the foundations of belief tremble beneath our feet, the question posed by the book that turned men into gods emerges more urgently than ever. What if the divine was never lost? What if it was never something to be found in temples, texts, or celestial realms? What if it was here, all along, encoded in the structure of your body, pulsing in the rhythm of your breath, whispering beneath your thoughts, waiting in the silence behind your eyes? The story we've been told is one of separation, that we fell, that we must be saved, that redemption is granted from above by an external force to which we must surrender. But the book offers another story, older, quieter, more dangerous. A story where the fall is forgetfulness and salvation is remembrance. A story in which the divine is not granted but grown, not worshipped but embodied. This is not a metaphor. It is an invitation. The book does not ask for belief. It asks for direct experience, for courage, for responsibility. It doesn't promise safety. It promises transformation. And transformation is never comfortable. It requires the death of the false, the dissolution of the borrowed, and the fierce emergence of something raw, real, and radiant. The reason this knowledge was hidden, suppressed, and demonized was not because it was evil, but because it made people ungovernable. It produced individuals who could not be manipulated by fear, who could not be bound by shame, who could not be reduced to numbers, roles, or ideologies. It awakened people into sovereignty, not as rebellion, but as resonance with a deeper order. The kind of order that predates every institution, every dogma, every empire. The divine order that exists not in the heavens above, but in the heart of everything. And so the book remains, not in a single location, but everywhere and nowhere. In a forgotten scroll, in a buried glyph, in a dream, in a sudden insight that cuts through the noise like a sword. It is not a doctrine to memorize, but a frequency to tune into. Those who hear it don't always recognize it. It may come as restlessness, as longing, as the quiet ache that there is something more, something just beyond the veil of ordinary life. For some, it arrives in crisis. For others, in stillness. But once it is heard, truly heard, it cannot be forgotten. It lives within like a question with no answer, a fire with no smoke, a path with no destination. It calls not toward worship, but toward awakening. Not to bow down, but to rise up. This rising is not grandiose. It is subtle, steady, internal. It begins with the reclaiming of attention, the cultivation of presence, the soft but relentless turning inward. The book does not need to be found. It needs to be activated. And activation begins the moment you stop seeking outside and begin listening within. You may find its pages not in ink and parchment, but in the pattern of your breath, the pulse of your blood, the geometry of a thought held still long enough to become light. This is the real secret. The book is not a thing. It is a process, a practice, a remembrance. It cannot be owned, but it can be lived. And when it is lived, even for a moment, the entire axis of identity shifts. You no longer ask what you are, but who you are becoming. So where does this leave us now? In a world flooded with information but starving for wisdom, the rediscovery of the book is not just an intellectual curiosity. It is a spiritual imperative. Not to escape the world, but to transform it from within. Not to claim superiority, but to become so inwardly whole that no external system can define your worth. The future does not belong to the passive. It belongs to those who remember, those who refuse to be hypnotized by noise, those who have the discipline to be still, to descend, to burn, to rise. These are the new initiates, not chosen by any order, but by their own readiness to carry the fire forward. And so, the final question is not whether the book was real. It is whether you are ready to become the kind of person who no longer needs to ask. Whether you are willing to step beyond the myths you inherited and embody the light you carry. Because in the end, the greatest secret is not in any ancient manuscript, any sacred site, or secret brotherhood. The greatest secret is this: you were the book all along, and now it is time to read yourself.